They just don't care. They just don't give a fuck. They're like, free trade, man, it's not our stuff. Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. We're recording this on Sunday, April 9th, 2017, and this is episode 27. Politicoast is a podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across the country. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or wherever you found this podcast. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticoastPod.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. And this week, we're running a bit behind, as I've just had a cold or a man flu or something the last few days, and I didn't feel like getting you sick or recording with a box of Kleenex here going every 5 minutes. But in that time, we've managed to backlog a ton of stuff to talk about, so we're just going to power through this episode with as few breaks as possible so I don't have to edit as long. But the first thing I want to say is, in the latter half of this episode, we'll have a snip of our interview with BC NDP MLA David Eby that we recorded with Barry from Glacier Media, and that this is Lotusland podcast. Next week, we'll hopefully cut in a bit of our conversation with BC Green Party Communications Coordinator Ryan Clayton, but most frustratingly, we just haven't been able to secure any BC Liberals, not an MLA, not a candidate, or any spokesperson. We were getting close to having someone, and then it just fell through and they don't get back to us anymore. So if you know a BC Liberal who would be interested in speaking to us, even just a very strong partisan supporter, send them our way or pester them on Twitter so we can get them on board. We don't want to roast them or anything. We want to have a fair conversation and treat them like we treated these other two.
Okay, and one quick note before we start. We're recording this on April 9th, which is the 100th anniversary of the start of the Battle of Vimy Ridge.
I was actually at Vimy when I was in Europe for living there for a couple of years, and I went out and took the train to a small town where you have to take a cab, and getting to the Vimy Memorial is really tough, but it's worth doing because it's just a unique place in the world because it's still scarred by the battles of the First World War, and the monument itself is massively impressive. And it's one of those monuments Hitler purposely went around because he had a sort of worship of the First World War and the battles and recognized that. But it always makes me a little uneasy because it's this sort of celebration of such a stupid war where it's not that they weren't brave, it's that they were thrown into this situation against their will and forced to throw their lives away. And so I'll commemorate their deaths and that pointlessness of it. Yeah,
it's kind of finding the diamond in a very rough situation of the First World War. But it nevertheless was quite a historic and noteworthy event because it was the first time the 4 Canadian divisions came together and fought as one corps.
So let's jump into our first segment, Failing to Make Healthy Decisions. On Thursday, the Ombudsperson released a big report into the health firings that happened back in 2012. For a bit of background on this, BC has what's called the Therapeutics Initiative, and this is an institute that was set up in 1994 to make evidence-based medicine better, to really find drugs that work and recommend ways to do it better. And so it released a number of reports and had a lot of good ideas, and it's still around. But it also held a lot of personal patient data and worked with a lot of pharma companies that held data. And there were leaks at a couple different times. And in 2012, the Ministry of Health started doing some internal review reports to see what was going on there. And they started firing people or terminating contracts or just not renewing people. And in the end, 8 people lost their job in the span of a few months at sort of senior positions. And there were a lot of allegations floating around of, it was these people who leaked private information to the media or to the public or accidentally got it out there. And the ministry at the time talked about handing this whole case over to the RCMP for an investigation, which puts a lot of pressure, just like we talked about the RCMP taking over the probe into the BC Liberals fundraising scandals and the fundraising scandals in BC.
And the probe they've just started this week on the land swap deal that we mentioned in our previous episode.
It's an escalation. It puts a lot of pressure on. So there was always a lot of air of confusion about what happened. And one of the things this led to is one of the people who lost their job committed suicide because of the pressure and sort of disgrace he was under. And this led to a lot of reviews of what exactly happened. And so in 2013 and 2014, there were a number of sort of small inquiries from the legislature. And this led to, in October 2014, Minister of Health Terry Lake and a few days later, Premier Christy Clark, both issuing apologies in the media and in the legislature, saying they were sorry about what all happened here. But all the time sort of avoiding the deeper dive into what happened and trying to play it off a bit. And so this ombudsperson eventually was given the authority to do a full investigation and interview everyone he could, and he came out with a number of recommendations and sort of a scathing report. His report does conclude that the government misled the public and bungled the fallout, and it still hasn't really compensated or properly apologized to the people fired. So it made a sort of token gesture, but needs to actually go further. And the things they recommend are an endowment scholarship, like $500,000 for future doctoral students at the University of Victoria, more staff funding for excellence in training, and then just lots of systemic changes to sort of deal with how employees are treated, how data is dealt with, what happens in the BC Coroner Service, and a lot of sort of nitty-gritty stuff that we won't get into. But the sort of saving grace for the Christy Clark government in the last week has been that the ombudsperson also found that there wasn't direct political interference in the firings. So since then, Clark has sort of talked about how this is almost a bureaucracy issue, like a civil service issue, and she's pinned the blame in the last day or two that way, sort of not really taking charge of the fact that the government does appoint the bureaucrats at some level. So that's sort of where it's at, and it's another one of these sort of scandals, but I'm still not sure it will stick. I mean, is Christy Clark basically made of Teflon at this point?
Well, I don't think this one's going to hurt them too badly, because it's one of those things that people just tend not to vote on. You know, improper firings tend to rate fairly low on the list of concerns for British Columbians. The bigger risk is it's just, another straw on that camel's back, and, like the Harper government, the little things that weren't quite right didn't really unseat them, but they ended up compiling over time and become that broader narrative of what the government was like. And that's the real risk here for the Liberals.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, it's not going to swing a lot of votes, but it does build that narrative of sort of out of touch, just doing things their own way. The bits on the misleading the public and sort of dealing with the fallout sort of get at a core competency of government and accountability. Like, this was a report that almost had to be dragged out of the government. They didn't want this report, and when it comes out like this, it's kind of clear why. This follows an Auditor General report last week that also criticized them over the BC housing sales. So there's all of these different angles that really make you go, are they doing things above board, or are they just too complacent? So I guess the question then becomes, how do the NDP or the Greens or whatever opposition party you choose capitalize on that? How do they actually turn each of these sort of individual scandals into a broader narrative?
That's a tough question, and there isn't really an easy answer on how to do that. It's just one of those things you kind of have to let accumulate over time and slowly chip away at the Liberals. It's not going to be something the opposition can just rally around in a way that really hurts the Liberals on it. It's going to have to be that slow chip. Moving on to segment 2, a deal 150 years in the making. The federal government and the provinces just released the text of the Canada Free Trade Agreement, which is basically the deal between the provinces and the federal government for freer trade and freer movement of goods and services within the country. Right now, there's kind of a lot of barriers to trade between the provinces. Everything from what time you can run oversized trucks on the highway, to licensing requirements, to requirements on government procurement to be in province only, to the antiquated Prohibition-era rules on alcohol sales and distribution. So there's just a lot of little things that stand in the way of really having a truly national market and economy, and this deal is there to change that and make it, Canada to be an actual common market rather than the patchwork we currently have. So this deal takes what's known as like a native list approach, where basically as a starting point, everything is to be free between the provinces, and any exceptions have to be explicitly put in the text. And there's a lot of them, which we'll be getting to. First, a lot of the kind of regulatory barriers, the agreement doesn't actually remove them, but starts a policy where the provinces have to meet and develop a strategy to get rid of them. So there's been some criticism on that front that this doesn't actually get rid of them right away.
Well, but nothing could do that. You can't just rewrite laws across the entire country overnight that quickly. It would just be chaos. I think this is one step in the road.
Yeah, just to push back on that a bit. This has been underway since the previous government. For example, Minister Moore, under the Conservatives, was pushing this through. So it isn't the sort of overnight thing. If this is a several-year deal-making process, you could have some of that written into the text rather than being just an agreement to go on it further, especially because there's been 6 months between when they finalized and when they've actually released the text.
It's one of the things, as I mentioned when I lived in Europe, is the European Union has this model, which, even though they're separate states, does have essentially a national federal government that they'll agree, pass a new law, and then every government underneath has to harmonize. They have to bring their laws in line. And this agreement is essentially that in some manner of now each province has to bring their regulations in line on the issues agreed upon, which no one's against in principle, I believe. There's the idea that, look, if your bottle has to be this big in BC and it has to be slightly different shaped in Alberta, that makes no sense if it's the same product. Like, let's just standardize that. I think the risk and the thing people always fear is, will we go for the highest standards or just sort of a race to the bottom? Like, let's get regulations out of the way, out of everywhere. And this doesn't answer that question, right? It's a sort of first step. So, in principle, it's a good thing, and it's where we need to go.
So, one of the big things that this changes is it limits the ability of governments to, insist on, say, buy British Columbian or buy Ontarian in their government procurements. And there's $170 billion gets spent every year on government procurement. So this opens it up quite a bit. And one of the impetuses for this was the CETA deal, which we've talked about a fair bit, imposes similar restrictions on governments. So if this hadn't been brought in, you'd have the weird situation where a company based out of France would be able to better bid on stuff in Canada than a company just on the other side of a provincial border. But this also does raise some questions. The NDP put out their IT and technology platform a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things in there was they're going to insist on buy local for their IT procurement. So I haven't heard yet how the NDP plans to respond to that, or if they're going to walk back their platform on this.
Maybe John Horgan will invoke the notwithstanding clause, because that's how that works in his mind sometimes, but I'm kidding. There are other sort of bigger issues with it. I think that you in particular take issue with the sort of idea that it's that big exceptions list, right? It's sort of leaving certain monopolies and certain government ownership, because in Canada, the way we've reached where we are today, different provinces have had different governments, obviously, and some nationalize large sectors and others never privatize them. And so in some provinces you have government-run oil companies or telecoms or liquor stores. Each provincial government does run its own liquor distribution branch, but at the sort of grassroots level, like, do I go to the LCBO, the BC liquor store, or just a private liquor store? And it varies whether you're in BC, Ontario, or Alberta, where there aren't government liquor stores anymore.
Yeah, and the exceptions list is the thing that kind of really sits in my craw the most about this. The document itself is about 300 pages long. Roughly 100 of them's the actual deal. The next 100 are the arbitration requirements for any disputes. And the last 100, so basically a third of the document, is just all the exceptions. And there's some really bizarre ones, like funeral directors in Quebec have to live in Quebec for at least 1 year before working in that industry. And it's just these weird little things and requirements. Travel agents in Ontario must live in, there's...
And no one even uses a travel agent anymore. Yeah, we have the internet.
Yeah, there's a lot of these really weird little things that have gotten carved out of this that just make no sense. And kind of the two big ones that really should have been changed is supply management, which we should have gotten rid of a long time ago, and there's really no reason either the left or the right should like that policy. It's the sort of thing that everyone ought to hate, but for some reason we just can't get rid of. And the other big one's the alcohol that we mentioned. It's a little ridiculous that you can't actually buy litter in one province and then take it into another province, even for your own consumption, or sell stuff across provincial lines, or any of these sorts of things. And right now there's a case going to the Supreme Court from someone who got arrested in New Brunswick for buying beer in Quebec. So hopefully that'll be gone by a court ruling soon enough, but it's just this outdated, ridiculous law. And I lived in Ontario. The Ontario litter system sucks. You have government-run stores, they have terrible hours. It's just like everybody hates the LCBO and the beer store bit too. So having this open up and be more free would be good, especially when it is hurting local brewers here, for example. Or requirements that some provinces have in their exceptions list that specifies a certain percentage of grapes must come from their province if you're going to sell blended wines. It's all these sorts of things that are still barriers to trade that we haven't actually got rid of and are going to hurt the economy, slow them down, and just provide worse service for Canadians.
In principle, I'm on board with the whole sort of idea of it. Andrew Coyne's got a sort of nice take on it in the National Post, and he outlines some of the strengths, some of the weaknesses. Trevor Tombe, however you say it, in Maclean's also has a sort of good and bad of it, and they break down very similar points. The one thing I take exception in Coyne's piece is right at the end he talks about confederation. One of the purposes was this idea that Canada should be created to make a common market, which is such a modern version of free market capitalism, when at least my sort of high school understanding of confederation was we need to sort of get together so America doesn't invade us, and so that we can also colonize all the racism part of it. It was more about that than we need to confederate so that people in Vancouver can trade freely with Toronto. That wasn't an issue in the mid-19th century when there wasn't as much trade. A bigger thing, if it was just about a common market, we would have never actually had confederation. We would have just stayed a British colony and traded freely with them. But I just want to push back on that pretend capitalist history that he's sort of implied upon other reasons for confederation.
I think this is more, it's a case of emphasis in the article, and it was one concern among many at the time, and it's just the articles on trade in Canada, so that's the bit that gets emphasized in the article on trade in Canada, is the trade in Canada aspect.
Overall, this is a good deal to see the sort of cross-partisan support for. This was something worked on hard by the Harper Conservatives and picked up by the Trudeau Liberals. And I mean, as an NDP, I could just say Trudeau or Liberal Tory, same old story, just always fighting against the working man or woman.
But in this case, one of the things in there is you're actually increasing labor mobility across provinces. So the working man doesn't have to get relicensed in every new province through this long and arduous process.
And as far as I can tell, the NDP aren't fighting against this. Or they've just failed to get headlines for it. I think it's not their top of mind issue, and so they're not, choosing to die on this hill like they are on changing the House of Commons rules, which the Conservatives are also on board with dying on that hill too. All right, for our third quick segment, the Trumpire strikes back. This week, Trump has managed to sort of alienate parts of his alt-right base, but also put Democrats in this weird position by launching a number of missile strikes on Syria after the Syrian government used chemical weapons, which was a sort of Obama red line that he ignored a couple times, I believe. I think the big issue here for me is just the arbitrariness of it. The idea of the US using military force in Syria has broad bipartisan support in the US, but when Trump's sort of behind it, you get the feeling like he just discovered the war room under the White House and went, oh, what does this button do? And started mashing it until cruise missiles started firing.
Well, except in this case, it was ordered from Mar-a-Lago, which is apparently the second White House now. It's a little weird.
Or third after New York, but...
So yeah, Thursday night or early Friday morning local time, the U.S. Navy launched 59 cruise missiles against a major airbase in Syria where the chemical attack was believed to have been launched from. Took out 20 Syrian airplanes, and that represents a fairly significant impact on the Syrian Air Force. And yeah, as we said, this was a response to the chemical attack 3 days earlier. And I think I'm more or less kind of in the same line on that, where this isn't actually, as far as a strike on Syria goes, it's a pretty reasonable one. It's targeted, it's proportionate, it aims at the assets that are directly responsible for the chemical attack. So overall, it's not bad, and it'd be a fine sort of thing as part of a broader Syria strategy. This is the attack Obama should have ordered in 2013 after the infamous Red Line. One of the main concerns I have is what's next. This is the sort of thing that's fine as part of a Syria strategy, but there isn't a Syria strategy. It's just kind of flailing around all over the place.
With missiles and weapons and explosions. The other sort of angle for me is the broader accountability of it. The US president over the past few decades has taken more and more liberties with their sort of war, essentially, with foreign relations, let's call it, how they use their military and their force, sort of outside traditional wars, because they don't really fight traditional wars anymore. It's these interventions or fighting the war on terror, which are very broadly and ill-defined. So the US isn't at war with Syria, but they're attacking them, which is a sort of war act. So the question is, should he be going to Congress, which is a Republican-dominated Congress, and even the Democrats could probably give him some support. He wouldn't have trouble there. Or should he even be going through the UN? And the UN is sort of went, that wasn't quite appropriate, at least talk to us.
That's the UN's default response on everything, and with Russia back in the Assad regime, the UN is basically a dead end on this one. It's just not the right venue to go after this in a direct way. We might get a report 3 years from now on it where they say, oh yeah, Assad was responsible, and then 2 years later we might finally get a resolution condemning it. Is as a matter of effectively putting foreign policy for the UN on these sorts of issues, especially when one of the parties is well connected with a permanent Security Council members, it's just not effective.
Well, and then there's other international bodies like NATO, which is sort of designed for this, especially when you're talking about versus Russia, because that's where NATO came from, to sort of be the bulwark against the Soviets. And the US will go its own way, but will it drag Canada in at all through NATO? And these are the sort of questions that I don't think we have clear answers for, even from our federal government.
This isn't the sort of thing that you're likely to see us get dragged into in terms of an Article 5 situation. The North Atlantic Treaty, the mutual defense provision in it is limited to the territories of the countries north of the Tropic of Cancer. So any situation happening in the Middle East, we're not going to get directly involved as hey, the U.S. has instituted Article 5 after, a ship or a plane of theirs got attacked in the region. So we're safe on that front. The bigger question is more what sort of support the NATO governments will give that isn't directly obligated by the treaty. We have troops in Iraq right now conducting operations against ISIS, and there's some ties into that with the Syrian civil war, though we haven't actually been operating in Syria, at least officially, the special forces, who knows. But it does raise some questions on, where's the U.S. policy with respect to the interaction between ISIS and the Assad regime and everything, which we're involved with through the anti-ISIS operations. There's other questions about just kind of what happens with Russia. Russia's already announced that they're going to stop cooperating with respect to coordinating aerial activities over the region and are moving more anti-aircraft assets into the region too. So there is some risk of further escalating Russia's commitment in the region too. And that's one of the reasons why this should have been done back in 2013 under Obama, before the Russians got heavily involved in the area, because there's a huge first mover advantage in this, because nobody actually wants a war between the two powers. So whoever can kind of set the rules in that theater first is basically going to dictate them, and that's unfortunately Russia at this point.
Well, the other interesting angle in here is the alt-right sort of neo-fascist subset of the Trump support that really liked his isolationism and refusal to get involved in the Middle East and just saying, oh, we'll let them do whatever they do. And now he's sort of just thrown that away in this attack. And so they're now like starting to get upset, and they're like, why are we getting involved again? Why are we shooting this down? It's just sort of delightful almost to watch his base get angry at him for doing what any other president probably would have done anyway.
Yeah, but that was one of the things he ran on was, no, don't get involved in Syria. If you elect Clinton, you were going to have a war in Syria, and less than 100 days into the presidency, there's U.S. military action there. And the pushback from sort of that base of alt-right voices is interesting and kind of might undermine a bit. But if anything, I think kind of the reversion to the more typical American foreign policy in some ways is almost reassuring if it wasn't so haphazard and all over the place with no strategic vision to it. And that is one of the things about the Trump administration is it's been, despite kind of really out there ideas and goals, they've kind of been confined between their own incompetence and the inertia of the Washington establishment to more or less stay more confined to the traditional operations of the U.S. government. However, they are kind of off on the terrible side of that. But yeah, overall, I think the strike itself wasn't a bad idea, but I just kind of wish it was part of a bigger picture strategy to the region. And, there was a clear, if this is going to be a red line, that's where the red line is, rather than a impulsive, I don't like what just happened, I'm going to launch a missile strike. Now to our bonus segment, David Eby and BC NDP. Now I want to play a bit of our interview from last week with David Eby. Eby's the NDP MLA for Vancouver Point Grey. You'll be able to hear the full interview on This is Lotus Land in their coming weeks, so subscribe to their podcast.
Dave, what do you think is going to be the big issue coming up in this general election?
Well, for me in Vancouver Point Grey, there are a lot of small community issues across the constituency that'll be really important for people who are voting in our specific race. I think if I were to think of one provincial issue, the issue of housing, I think is the one that crosses the most boundaries in the province. There's a huge homeless city in Victoria for an extended period. There's low vacancy rates and climbing house prices on the island. There's the same issue in Kelowna. It's the same issue in Vancouver. It's similar but different in Kamloops and in Prince George and Terrace. So I think the housing issue, although it takes on different shapes in different communities, is going to be a dominating issue for many local elections.
So we've seen the Liberals try to make some moves over the last year on housing, trying to identify foreign buyers as an issue and other things. What would the BC NDP do differently to try to actually address these issues?
Yeah, probably one of the best indications that housing is going to be a serious issue is when a party that has $10 million to spend on polling and research really focuses their attention on the issue. It tells you that they're seeing that show up regularly, and certainly in the public domain polling, we're seeing that too. I think that the Liberals are pretty late to the game on the housing issue to be credible on it. They are selling off a large number of publicly owned BC housing sites. They're using that money to put back into social housing, new social housing projects. They plan on raising about $500 million this way. The Auditor General just issued a report saying that this approach is actually going to cost $1 billion to raise $500 million for taxpayers, but this is what they're doing. And certainly increasing the supply of housing for the very poor is an important thing to do, especially with growing tent cities across Metro Vancouver and South Vancouver Island. I think the big distinction between the NDP and the Liberals is going to be more on the issue of housing for the workforce, for middle-class people who are working at decent jobs and they're earning a reasonable living and they can't find a place they can afford to rent and they can't get into the housing market. The Liberal solution to that, they've spent a huge amount of money advertising this program where you can take a second mortgage to get a down payment. is proving not popular. They've been at it for 3 months. They wanted to spend $700 million on these loans. They've spent $4 million. They've only had just over 270 people successfully apply and receive these loans, despite spending a huge amount on advertising. So the program's not being taken up. Understandably, people don't want more debt. They're already so profoundly in debt. We need to increase the supply of affordable housing for the workforce. And our proposal around that, and I don't want to spend a ton of time going too deep into policy, but as just examples, for students, for example, the government banned borrowing for colleges and universities to build residences, even where the rents for students would pay for the cost of that borrowing. Gordon Campbell said he was going to fix it. In a thrown speech, he lost his job before he was able to fix it. We would fix that. And the universities and colleges tell us they would build thousands of units of housing for students, getting them out of the private market, opening up rental housing. We would put an additional property tax on people buying properties in Metro Vancouver who don't pay their worldwide income tax in British Columbia, who are not tax residents here. And the reason for that is simple. We think that everyone's got to pitch in. And if your house that you're investing in is going up in value, you need to help pay for the provincial services that make that house go up in value. And that would raise, we're told in Metro Vancouver, somewhere between $100 and $200 million a year. And that money will go back into affordable housing initiatives for, among others, people who are working and living in British Columbia. And then last, just one policy to touch on, there's a lot of public land out there that the provincial government is currently selling off to the highest bidder, which means that the developments on those sites will be almost invariably as much luxury housing as can be built on those sites. We would be using that public land to do what government used to do, like on South False Creek, which is build mixed income communities, because if you can control the cost of land, if you can keep it in a land trust, for example, you can make housing significantly more affordable. That's the biggest cost in relation to housing in areas hard hit by the housing crisis. It's the cost of land.
Okay. You've talked a fair bit about kind of the lower end of the market and student housing, housing for low-income people, as well as targeting kind of investment properties. What about the mid-market, kind of middle class, people who used to be able just to buy a house here but aren't able to afford it anymore?
Right. So part of the challenge in the housing market, as I see it, is that we have a very significant amount of speculative activity in the housing market. So the last census that the numbers were just released, tens of thousands of vacant homes in Vancouver alone. So when you have so many vacant homes and people are trying to get into the housing market, what it's doing is it's inflating prices and quite dramatically. When we look at housing supply, it seems to be keeping pace with population growth. But when we look at the actual housing that's being built, small studio apartments with executive chefs and valet services is not going to be useful for people who are living and working, looking for a place for their family in Metro Vancouver. So we need to be addressing that shortage of housing supply that's actually affordable for people who live, work, and pay taxes in Metro Vancouver. And the way that we do that is we address this sort of toxic demand, as I see it, of speculators. And the story that I tell is the story about Lawrence Fink. And Lawrence Fink is the head of the largest investment firm in the world. It's called BlackRock. It's based in the United States, $4.3 trillion under management, who said, don't buy oil or gold, buy Vancouver condos as a great investment. We need to target that kind of demand because it is not beneficial to our community except for the temporary job of building the luxury condo. And then after that, it's quite dead weight for our community and it's driving up the cost of housing. So we target that with the tax, the additional property tax on people who aren't paying their income tax here. And then we turn that money around into things like incenting the construction of rental housing like the federal government used to do that built the West End, using public property and subsidizing it with some of the proceeds of the tax like was done in South False Creek, making sure that there are projects that are built that are actually affordable for people to buy into. And there are different ownership models. There's co-ops, leasehold, land trust. There's a ton of different ways we can do it. I don't know what the perfect model is going to be for BC, but I do know that we need to do a better job of testing and experimenting different models to make that happen, and the government can bring a lot to the table if the government was committed to do that, and they're not committed to do that currently.
Talking about sort of the foreign executives, the one thing that's been so big in the news in the last couple of weeks is the foreign donors to the BC Liberals and all the sort of other fundraising scandals. And I don't think we need you to just like rip on the Liberals, but
I don't mind.
Oh, yeah, of course you don't mind.
I don't mind.
But one thing that
the BC Greens did is they came out and said, we're not going to accept corporate and union donations. And they've bragged about how many donations they've gotten since, just from individuals of sort of small and medium-sized donations. So why is the NDP not taking that similar sort of principled stance?
Yeah. Well, our leader, John Horgan, has been really clear. I mean, we've put now 6 times, I think, in the legislature, a bill to ban union and corporate donations and put strict limits on individual donations. And people say, well, not people. Christy Clark says, well, the NDP wants the public to subsidize political parties. Well, you just look across the border to Alberta. The NDP government did there is they put strict limits on those donations. They banned union and corporate donations. It was their first bill. It was Bill 1. And the public does not pay to support those political parties in Alberta. So it's definitely doable. It's something that we can do and achieve. The question, though, of in British Columbia, why would the NDP make the call to continue to accept large donations from unions and companies is a good one. And it was one that we wrestled with and we had a lot of good conversations about. But the bottom line was that we simply did not believe that we could communicate to people in the same way that the government can. If we didn't take those donations, we simply wouldn't be able to raise enough money. And you know, I can appreciate the Greens' perspective on this, but with respect to them, the last figures I saw, they were quite challenging to go up against a $10 million juggernaut, which is the BC Liberal fundraising. And even saying that, you know, we have a much smaller number of donors at that level. In addition, we have a much larger base of individual donors. I mean, for the BC Liberals, half of their donations come from 3% of their donors. 50% of the donations come from 3%, the top 3%. The wealthiest people in our society, cutting some of them 7-figure checks over time to the BC Liberal Party. It's a very big deal. We don't have that in the NDP, but we do have donations from unions and corporations. It's a practice that we don't like. But it's one that the decision's been made that we should be competitive in this election. And it's also hard because the government is also using, it turns out, tax dollars to advertise to the public about their electoral plans as well. So not only do we have to deal with the big money in politics for the BC Liberal Party, but also tax dollars being used for advertising.
So would that be John Horgan bill number 1 to sort of follow Rachel Notley's model? Or
yeah, boy, I hope it's bill number 1. I think it's a really important issue in this election, but it may be bill number 2 or 3.
Okay. And
no promises.
Would you also plan to review how the government does advertising and put new restrictions on that?
Yeah, one of the things that we've said we would do is implement a model around government advertising that would require the Auditor General's office to review and sign off. And one of the things that the government said about their publicly funded advertising campaign was that the Auditor General's office had reviewed and signed off on their ads, which, of course, unfortunately, had not happened. And so, but we would actually make that a requirement because there are certainly situations where government needs to advertise to people. And if I can say, the BC Liberals are doing a campaign right now around naloxone and response to fentanyl overdose crisis. And I think everyone can agree that that's a useful use of advertising money. But spending millions of dollars to advertise a home loan program where only 275 people have successfully received that loan seems unnecessary, excessive, and frankly, directly election related.
And now on to a few quick takes to close off the show. First up, the BC Liberals are promising to put a $500 annual cap on tolls so that people crossing the Golden Ears, Port Mann, Massey Tunnel, and the Patello Bridges,
when those last two get replaced,
won't have to pay more than $500 a year, which I guess if you're a road commuter is the kind of thing that's music to your ears.
Yeah, so right now it's estimated that a full year's commute with those tolls is going to cost roughly $1,600 plus or minus a couple $100 on either side of it. So this represents a significant scaling back of the cost going over those bridges for regular commuters. That's made the BC director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation pretty happy, calling this a welcome commitment to reducing the cost for British Columbians.
The CTF never has a fee or tax they like, so...
Yeah, but you got to wonder, the hell are they thinking here? Because the bridges have to get paid for somehow, and if it's not getting paid for by the users of the bridge, it's going to be coming out of their taxes some other way. And at least with the road tolls, it's the people who actually use the bridge who would have to bear a part of the cost of it.
I'm totally on board with you. This is a straight up cash for votes kind of subsidy to drivers in the suburbs who drive into downtown Vancouver a lot. And it's sort of selling out the costs of the bridges and costs of the infrastructure onto everyone's municipal taxes, onto everyone's income taxes, wherever else you can get it, gas taxes, and just generally a bad plan. It's sort of pocketbook economics without the broader strategy.
Already drivers are subsidized way too much. They don't really pay for the full cost of the road, often don't pay for the full cost of parking, the congestion they cause. The way we structure things already has subsidized suburban development, subsidized car commutes, and the bridge tolls are kind of one slight pushback against it that already doesn't really go far enough. And scale it back even more just kind of, I think, undermines the long-term urban health of the region. SFU professor Tom Davidoff criticized the proposal, basically pointing out it's an anti-congestion charge in that the people who regularly use the bridge and who will most likely be using the bridge at rush hour when it's most crowded are going to be paying less than everyone else. And if anything, you should be flipping that. If they want to reduce the cost of tolls on the bridge, cut the cost on off-peak hours. Right now it's $3.15, I believe, to cross the Port Mann Bridge. Make it $2.50 for off-rush hour commutes or something.
Or say you don't have to pay tolls until you hit $500 a year. So people who only use it sometimes, like for a weekend trip, don't pay it. This isn't a strategy I actually want to see implemented, but at least then you'd be encouraging casual use rather than commuting use. This one is a subsidy for commuters.
Yes, and as anyone who's ever tried to drive to work in Vancouver knows, it's already pretty terrible. And just making it that much easier to drive in from the suburbs is just going to make things worse. And not only that, the cap is less than the cost of a bus pass. So it's, absolutely a subsidy for car traffic, which the region already really can't take much more of. The local roads are more or less at capacity. The Port Mann Bridge itself's not quite at capacity, but kind of everything else in the region is. So, if anything, this is going in the wrong direction. We should be looking at more congestion charges, not reducing the few sort of ones we've got on a couple of bridges.
Well, we're talking transit and infrastructure. There were a couple other related stories this week. The BC government or the BC Liberals, it's kind of blurred right now in this pre-election period. Transportation Minister Todd Stone was going to do an announcement for the George Massey, sort of a groundbreaking project for the tunnel replacement project. Only, I guess it started to rain or something, they decided to move inside. But he was also a bit late, so protesters actually managed to preempt his event, saying, we don't want an ugly-ass bridge. We can do something else, but the bridge you planned is an eyesore, and kind of mocked the government a little bit.
I actually kind of like the design of the bridge. Cable State bridges look nice, but I think the bigger problem is the massive interchange right after it, and the fact that 10 lanes to Delta and back is a little ridiculous in terms of the scale of the bridge. The tunnel needs to go, but why are we putting 10 lanes of traffic in as a replacement?
The perfect irony of the story is that Todd Stone was delayed by traffic in the Massey Tunnel. Which I guess makes his case, but
yeah,
that just means we need a little bit more, and some smarter plans, not just throw as many lanes as you can imagine over that.
Well, getting delayed in the tunnel is kind of the default state for travel through the tunnel.
And speaking of tunnels, the BC government didn't get much press last week, but after the federal government announced that there would be funding for the Broadway subway line and the Surrey light rail, the BC government said they would be matching that, so there will be money for those two major projects coming forward. And the Daily Hive also noticed that in the agreement between the City of Vancouver and CP Rail when they bought the Arbutus corridor that actually is only a couple blocks from where we are, the city promised to bring in light rail and to include it in the plans, and the city says, yeah, we're actually still looking at that. They've paved it now, and it's a nice, actually pretty busy walkway from almost the Fraser River to Falls Creek. And going forward, that is going to be sort of an arterial transit line for the city, and light rail will hopefully come along with that.
Yeah, it's a welcome addition to the area, and that was actually one of the original proposals for the Canada line, which since ended up going down Cambie. was to run it down Arbutus instead on that corridor. It's nice the BC government's finally kicking in some money for the long overdue Broadway subway. There's still the downside that they're only going into Arbutus rather than UBC for the first bit, which still I think makes a huge amount of sense. It's better to do it all at once and save a little money rather than having to restart construction later on. But, it's at least something, and half the riders on the currently over capacity 99B line that runs along what's going to be the subway route do get off before Arbutus, so at least does some good on that. Yeah, and in terms of the light rail, that's not a bad idea. There are some concerns that there's a few areas on the corridor where it isn't wide enough to run 2 trains side by side, so there's probably going to have to be some creative engineering to get around that.
Or capacity limits on how many trains if they have to wait for one to go through.
Yeah,
which is never ideal, but
or do a little cut and cover on part of it and run one direction underneath the other. There's a few options on there.
Monorail.
Yeah, our that Easeway group, I'm sure, is looking for a little money that people we mentioned that the BC Conservatives were looking at, but somehow I don't think that's likely to happen. I wouldn't mind seeing either something a little more high capacity than light rail go in there, just to. The corridor isn't really at the point where it could use a full-on subway, but, if the city actually does the densification it needs to do, at some point it will be needed and would be a nice change. Plus, you keep the nice walkway they've got going on there largely undisturbed once it's been recovered. The RCMP has finally revealed some of the information about why Vice Admiral Mark Norman was relieved of his position, and they allege he's violated the criminal code by leaking government secrets. This is related to a 16-month probe about the decision to award a Quebec-based shipbuilding company, Davie Shipyards, a contract for the new naval supply ships. When the story first broke and he'd gotten relieved, we kind of had a fair bit of speculation. Nobody really knew what this was about. So it's nice they have a little more information out there. And it's alleged that the Admiral was very irritated about the level of cabinet and government interference in the shipbuilding program and the contracts related to that.
He was frustrated by the Irving shipyard versus the Quebec shipyards, who gets a sole source contract, and Irving claiming that they could undercut it, but then getting cut out of the ability to bid on this shipbuilding. And
the fact that Irving has a lower cost solution to anything's a little shocking in
and
this.
Doesn't have good connections to a government. We're going to have to keep our eye on this because this is one of those slow building, hard to know if the sort of internal military politics, as it were, is going to spill over into the federal realm and actually start to tarnish any specific politicians. In related sort of controversies involving the military, Canada's top soldier, Jonathan Vance, is suggesting the armed forces actually does have enough money, sort of contrary to the calls that, our military is woefully underfunded and couldn't go to war if it had to. I think perhaps he's trying to bolster the PR of the army to say, look, we're okay. We could probably use more, but if you told us to go to war, we wouldn't be putting our soldiers in danger.
Yeah, the military never likes to admit it's not ready to do stuff. And the CDS here does kind of have a point where he's mentioning that one of the major issues isn't so much the funding, it's the problems with the procurement and getting the bureaucracy to kind of get the contracts through and actually initiate that portion. And that's, of course, been an issue. It's taken 10 years to buy new pistols. The process to replace our fixed-wing search and rescue aircraft has been going on for more than a decade now, and in the meantime, they've gotten so old we're having to literally scrounge parts from museums to keep them in the air. So there's concerns here where there's definitely process issues, but at the same time, there's a lot of problems with just not enough funding. We're spending 1%, or under 1% of GDP right now, which is the lowest point since the Second World War in terms of how much we're spending on defense. And there's numerous issues. Training budgets have been cut, stuff's gotten scaled back. The naval supply ships, which we just mentioned, have been retired, and there isn't a replacement ready to go yet. Like, there's a lot of problems here. In terms of the Army, the labs, which served very well in Afghanistan, but a decade in a desert environment does a lot of damage even without enemy action, and they need a significant upgrade and replacement. They're taking way too long to get upgrades and replacements done too. So overall, the equipment is old and in dire need of replacement, and yeah, there's room to improve the process, but at the same time, getting a lot more money into there would be very helpful too. And it doesn't help that the government just put off a whole bunch of spending for 20 years on the stuff.
Well, one government that is spending more seems to be the BC government, who, according to most of the pundit journalist class on hashtag BCPoly on Twitter and on the CBC, report being inundated with a flood of BC government press releases over the last month. The CBC specifically says in March they received 382 press releases versus 171 in February, which is still at least 4 a day if you assume they're sending them on weekends, which they generally don't. The journalist writing that points out that they received over 30 press releases on Friday alone, which is a nice way for the government to just sort of bury a lot of news, because journalists are generally going home on Friday and coming back on Monday, and then they'll get to writing their stories. And by then they have new news to actually write about. None of this is illegal. Governments are allowed to spend as much as they want on communications. It just gets into this fuzzy realm of, we have an election coming up and the government is starting to ramp up its communications at the same time when the political parties should be ramping up their communications.
Yes, and the BC government has made several announcements of new funding that's come out since the legislature rose for the end of its final sitting before the election, but the writ hasn't dropped yet, so technically we're not in an election campaign, even though everybody knows we're in an election campaign, which also means the caretaker convention, which basically means only like essential government functions carry on, and any new announcements, new major policies don't get undertaken during an election campaign. But with the fixed election laws, it's kind of a little fuzzy on where it is, and perhaps the convention needs to be rethought out if you're going to have a period of a couple of weeks between when the legislature rises for the last time before an election and when the election officially starts.
For all the complaints about the longest election ever, or almost ever, that we had in the federal scene in 2015, at least that meant the government of Canada wasn't sort of an arm of the Harper Conservatives trickling out the announcements. So you had this long period as an official caretaker, which even meant the Syria refugee crisis really came to the front in the middle of that. And the Conservatives had to actually get consensus with the Liberals and the NDP to come up with, all right, we do need to do something as a country, as a government, and here let's all agree that this isn't a partisan issue, we want to save lives, so here's something we can put in the interim. And that's how you do it. You don't sort of use the government as an arm of your party.
Yeah, and in fact, that was one of the reasons that Harper explicitly said during the press conference in early August when he initiated the election was, hey, it's an election, everyone knows it's an election, we can either officially start it now or we can, unofficially do it, but everybody's going to know it's there without any real rules. So, points to him, I guess, on that. But it did lead to a few awkward situations. The Syria refugees, and also the signing of the TPP happened during the election, and there's some questions on whether or not that was appropriate. But with a trade deal as big as that, if you had to stop every time one of the parties had some sort of election, it would never get negotiated. So, yeah, more or less okay on that one. But this is not that case. This is the government basically campaigning while still in office. And that has been Politicos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. And if you have any ideas for the show, feel free to send it to us. Thanks for listening.